The Limb by Mac Ralston. Crickets. About what I expected from Em, but tonight they were literal, and all around us. Finally, though, she spoke up. "How am I supposed to see him if he's in it?" she asked, pressing that tiny wrinkled face of hers into the binoculars and gritting her teeth. She had braces now, blue ones, her favourite colour, and at that sight I realised she wasn't as little as I saw her. I guess she was ready for it. She was already looking more and more like her mother each day. God, how old was she now? How old was I? I took in a breath of that crisp, alpine air and rubbed her back. It was warm because of the fire, and I knew as long as we were in it, we wouldn't need the bug spray. Not yet, anyway. "He's not actually in it, Em," I said, gazing at her, gazing up at the moon. "It's a figure of speech." "What's that?" I sighed. "It means like remember when Mum used to say to you, 'Come here, Peach'?" "Yeah," Em said, never once lowering the binoculars. She was a curious cat just like her old man. "Well, are you a peach?" "No," she drawled. "Right, 'cause that's a figure of speech. Just like how there's no guy actually in the moon. People just say you can see faces on its surface." I repositioned myself on the log and leaned down, closer to her face. "Do you see those craters I was telling you about?" "Yeah." "Those are his eyes." She paused. "Actually?" "Well," I said, rolling my eyes until they met with the white ball in the sky. "That's what people say. People also say the moon's made of cheese, but—" "It's made of cheese!" At this point, Em completely abandoned the whole stargazing thing and dropped the binoculars to her lap. I let out a soft chuckle and realized that if there was one thing to grab Em's attention, it was cheese. Speaking of which, I remembered, at that point, that I had packed some, both string and cubed. "I don't know," I shrugged. "I've never tried it." "The moon?" Em asked with eyebrows raised. Again, I chuckled and reached into my knapsack, pulling out the cubes. "Yeah," I winked, tossing her the Ziploc baggie of cheese cubes. "Why don't you give these moon rocks a taste and tell me?" A slick smile crossed Em's face as she popped open the bag and shoved a handful of moon rocks into her mouth. I grinned. "Cheesy?" She nodded delightedly. I leaned back some, careful not to force the moss-smothering timber to roll out from under me. Peered up into the night sky, as only the crickets, crackle of the fire, and my daughter munching on cheese filled the silence that was otherwise deafening. There was hardly any light pollution up there, and the only glow to be seen was that of the milky moon and maybe a handful of fireflies. I sighed. It was now time for the dreaded talk. The talk. The whole reason I'd brought Em out here. I wish Mum could have been here to tell you this, but... "What?" She cocked her head like a bird. I shook my long face and couldn't help but roll my eyes as the slight smile smeared across it. Victoria was so much better at these types of things. "Well, you're getting older, Em," and a flash of light streaked across the sky. Em looked up and immediately pointed a finger into the dark clouds looming overhead. A second later, a second finger formed a peace sign, and she continued verbally. 3, 4... A crack of thunder boomed somewhere in the distance. Em's hand wadded into a fist, then she turned to me. 4 miles away, Dad," she said. I nodded down at her. "Em, you're getting older and—" I started, still looking down at her. And well, I'm proud of you." I checking out. "Thanks, Daddy," she said. I nodded and stood just as another flash shone through the trees. Again, Em started counting. 1, 2. A rumble of thunder shook the ground, and I immediately threw my head over my shoulder and eyed the tent. "I think we should call it a night," I said, turning back to face Em. She was already nodding in agreement, so I hoisted her up, carried her inside, and zipped her all cozy into her sleeping bag, which was blue, of course. She yawned and whispered, "Good night," to me as she turned over. And again I rubbed her back as another flash and roll of thunder ricocheted through the forest. Before I hit the sack myself, I stuffed the Ziploc of marshmallows into my knapsack and carried it off into the tree line, about 200 feet away from the fire. On an old, slender oak tree where I had tied off the rope to our clothesline, I draped the knapsack full of snacks and bug sprays and sunscreens on a limb about 6 feet off of the ground. If there were any bears or critters around, I wasn't going to lead them straight back to our camp. Then, once the bag was secured, I turned and started trudging through the open field of high grass towards the fire, just as a trickle of rain dotted my arm. I took a final, defeated glance back at the line of nearly dry clothes at the forest edge and shook my head, realizing I was going to be sporting my pajamas on the hike back to the car. I woke in a hot sweat. Flushed, I unzipped my bag and sat up, the top of the nylon fabric grazing my forehead, which was caked in sweat and draped in my bedhead. I immediately felt the cold stream of rainwater bleed through the fabric and onto my scalp, and I fell back onto the ground, into the sultry sleeping bag. I shot my hand across the dark to feel for Em, and that's when my nightmare manifested. She wasn't there. I unzipped the tent and thrust myself into the pattering rain, flashlight in hand, binoculars swaying from my neck. I looked around. The fire was nearly out, and all the fireflies were gone. I called out to her. "Em? Em?" No response. I got louder, not caring if any bears heard me. "Emma! Peach!" I was only met with a distant grumble of thunder. Not even the crickets accompanied me now. I took a step forward, closer to the dying fire, and flicked my flashlight on, aiming it at the muddy ground. It was littered with cheese string. "What the hell?" I murmured. I immediately shot the flashlight's beam to the tree line. The knapsack was gone, and the distant ground was scattered with Em and I's clothes. I could feel warmth stream down my face, and I realized it wasn't the rain. It was my tears. I let out a shrill cry, a gush of breath materializing from my mouth as I took a step closer to the faraway forest, unsure of what to do as the grass crunched beneath my socks. The pale moon lingered off in the distance, its oblong, faceless face mocking me. I lifted the binoculars to my eyes and peered through. Em wasn't anywhere to be seen. Only the angular limbs of the trees and the tethered rope that once upheld our clothes, now barren, aside from a single black tie. That's when she faded into view. Em. From somewhere within the pitch-black brush of trees she emerged, seemingly skipping. I instantly felt that spring in my footing to start galloping towards her, but something held me back. Something that turned that hot sweat of mine into a sting of sharp coldness running down my neck. Her feet weren't touching the ground. My bedhead stood on end as I realized what she was doing. She was hanging there, like how our clothes hung from the line, and through the now foggy lens of the binoculars, I could see, through my tears, that her face was drooped like that of a wilted flower, and that the little print she was doing was nothing more than the thing holding her up, that limb bouncing her ever so slightly up and down like the rattling of a cat toy. I'm paralyzed here now, standing in this field across from the woods, a dead fire and a flooded tent behind me. Not only because I know that isn't my daughter, and that I would never bring a tide to go camping. But I have now realized gravely, that isn't the moon. The Tale of the Wendigo by Anonymity 3. Randy stumbled under the weight of the camping gear, grabbing at shrubbery to keep from tumbling down the hill. I looked back at him, sighing softly before I made my way over to his tiny frame, sliding over brightly colored leaves. Reaching around him, I attempted to grab the strap of one of his packs, beginning to lift it from his shoulders. "Here, let me take it." "No!" His brown hair, the same shade as his brother's, masked his eyes as he shook the pack violently, displacing my grip. "I can do it myself!" I frowned slightly, my hand still poised above the strap as Randy straightened the pack on his shoulders. "Randy, you should know better than let a lady carry the weight," a deep voice called from behind us. Randy and I both turned to see Kyle, clicking his tongue in disapproval, as he pulled himself forward by a small tree that shook under his weight. "Now go on up that hill. It's not that heavy. You're 13 now, a man. So I don't want any complaints." Randy nodded vigorously, flushed face steeling itself as he continued on. "He's not one of your pledges, Kyle. He's your younger brother." "Chelsea, I'm toughening him up a bit. There's no harm in it." I folded my arms across my chest, pursing my lips in disapproval. Jack laughed from behind Kyle, Bear clawing up the remainder of the hill before pulling down 2 beers from his pack and offering one to me. "Lighten up, Chels, we're just messing around." I eyed Jack warily before taking the beer and popping the tab. A loud thud echoed from the peak of the hill, the 3 of us turning to see Randy on his stomach, uprooting a small bush as he attempted to clamber to his feet. Jack and Kyle threw each other a smirk before racing up the remainder of the hill, shouting commands at Randy as they went. Running my hand through my hair in exasperation, I turned my eyes to the sky as I meandered forward, surveying the stars and the full moon. It was amazingly bright that evening, a perfect night for camping. I'd always been fond of the woods. Throughout my high school years, I was prone to disappearing beneath the looming branches, failing to resurface for hours at a time. They'd been my safe haven, offering sanctuary from the most tiresome of tests and petty high school struggles. But that night, something was off. I couldn't help but feel small, vulnerable in the vast expanse around me. It was as if on that evening, the wind bit just a bit harder, the trees rustled just a decibel louder, and the shadows danced just a bit more wildly. "We're here!" Kyle exclaimed as Randy threw the gear down, bending forward to rest his hands on his knees and spitting onto the muddy ground. The tree before us had been massive, its roots creeping over the surrounding earth, twisting over its surface before diving back beneath the hard clay. Its size, although impressive, was merely an afterthought to the tear that extended directly down the center of the trunk. The bark an ashy black along the edges of a now gaping hole. The split itself was big enough for at least 2 people to stand in comfortably, and somehow had managed not to pose much of a detriment to the tree as its branches stretched forward, leaves golden and red. "So this is it? An old tree?" Jack laughed, shaking his messy blonde hair in disapproval. "There's a good story. Save it, Kyle. Nature's calling. I'll listen to your horrifying story later." Jack waved his hand in mock terror before slinking into the expansive greenery before us, disappearing into the abyss. I finished my own beer before sitting down on a rock, wandering over to where Randy stood, tussling his hair affectionately as he shot me a smile. "Alright, well, since Jack seems to feel like being a dick tonight..." Kyle raised his voice slightly on the last 3 words, turning to look behind him with a smirk. "I guess I'll tell the 2 of you." I rolled my eyes at Kyle's dramatics, but felt Randy straighten up a bit, leaning in. Many, many years ago, there was a tribe of Indians that lived in the marshlands. Now, there have been many tribes to come from the southern marshes, but this specific tribe was of particular note. It wasn't because they were the best warriors, the most adept at survival, or even had the best folk tales. In fact, compared to the surrounding tribes, they're rather historically insignificant as a whole. No, this tribe is only known because of one thing and one thing only. This tribe was cursed. It was plagued by a disease that turned men into murderous beasts that stalked the night in madness. Such curses are hardly happened upon, and when those who are brave enough would ask about the origin of the curse, the only response from the other tribes was that there had once been a violation of nature, so perverse and so heinous that men were forced to wear their transgressions in the form of a transformation. Although the original perpetrators of this crime against nature were run off or had mysteriously vanished many years ago, the curse lived on, claiming men from the tribe and those who took their women. It was never clear who this curse was going to affect, but it followed the tribe like a shadow, always lurking behind them as they walked through the centuries. The Wendigo, as they called those who were afflicted with a curse, was a beast that tore the flesh from its victims and bathed in their blood. It was even known to enjoy the putrid delicacy that was rotting flesh, unearthing the dead when it felt the need, leaving nothing but scraps in its ravenous wake. It was rumored to have dug up hundreds of the surrounding tribes' graves and taken many more live victims, and the curse impacted all those who came in contact with the tribe. Because of this, these people were feared and rejected. This isolation, drew up by the chieftains of old, allowed the neighboring tribes to live without incident for many years, until white men entered the land with small pieces of thin, flexible cloth with red wax on them, declaring that the natives were now on someone else's land and needed to relocate. When the wars had been fought and the white man had defeated the tribe's warriors, a truce was drawn. In the truce, there was a single condition which the chieftains demanded be met if the white men wished them to live in peace: that their tribes were to be relocated before the white men made contact with the tribe on the furthest edge of the marsh. Amused by the superstition of the chieftains, the white men agreed, keeping their word and allowing the tribes to leave before they made their way to the edge of the marshlands. The white men entered the marshes in the dead of night, and, after many days, found the tiny tribe living on a small plot of land. The men descended on the natives, demanding that the chieftain of the small tribe move his people from the marshes to a newly plotted reservation. In an attempt to appeal to the white men, the chieftain gave his only daughter to the leader of the group, Thomas Dittany. When Dittany looked upon the beautiful woman, her black hair held tight with intricate braids, eyes as dark as the night sky, lips as red and full as the wild rose petals she wore around her neck, he fell madly in love with her. He immediately drew up a truce with the chieftain, marrying the girl the next morning. With the truce, the people lived in harmony, often trading and socializing with one another. They threw raucous parties during the harvest season and banded together in the bleakest of the winter months. The tribe was happy to have been accepted into the world again, and the white men found that the natives knew much about the land, including survival skills passed down through the tribe for centuries. All was peaceful, and perhaps this was one of the most amicable encounters between Indians and Americans for years to come. This unity, however, ended late one August evening, when the beautiful Indian wife of the newly appointed Governor Dittany ran screaming into the white village. Many of the villagers attempted to calm the woman down as she babbled on about an ancient curse. Her fit of hysteria continued for nearly an hour before her face turned deadly pale and she dropped dead onto the square. Dittany, so broken by the sight of his dead wife, Her once tanned face, now pale and cold, was driven to the brink of insanity, forbidding anyone to move her body for burial. The men of the village tried to talk sense into the governor, but he persisted, stating that the next person to attempt to move her body would be given a death sentence. After his outburst, the governor locked himself in the upper room of his home, refusing to speak to a soul and seeking comfort for his grief and solitude. The villagers would only see him at the first light of dawn, when he would slowly make his way to the body of his wife, laying a bouquet of wild roses in her hands before the sun had fully risen, scampering back to his home when done, running from the light as if the sun's rays would sear his very flesh. This continued on for a week, and when the sun had set on the 7th day, the killings began. Men, women, and children were found slaughtered every night, stripped of flesh and devoid of blood. Even corpses began to be torn from their graves, bloated bodies missing rotting flesh. Villagers started to talk as the body in the square ripened, flesh peeling from the woman's bones in thin, crusted layers. They wondered at first, in silence, why a dead body, laying in the open, would be left untouched by this creature. Certainly it would be easier to take the body in the open, rather than dig in the earth for more. As the days passed and the more bodies were found, the townspeople began to wonder aloud, accusing Dittany of the heinous crimes. It seemed to be the only logical explanation. The untouched corpse had been his wife, after all, and it was obvious that he'd been driven to insanity by her death. Soon the townspeople showed up at Dittany's doorstep, demanding an answer, but they received none. They banged on the door until a frightened servant boy answered, his frail body being thrown aside as the men of the village assaulted the house, searching for the absent governor. The people searched Dittany's home, overturning sealed government documents and rummaging through his stores of rancid food. Blood covered the walls, and when the villagers had finally pushed their way into the upper room of the house, bodies lay strewn across the floor. Their tongues swollen as empty arteries looked angrily up at the men before them. Maggots littered the floor, crawling in and out of the bodies, the lifeless mounds undulating with the maggots' excursions. The flesh and the muscle of the corpses had obviously been cleaved from the bone. The oldest bodies seemed to have been dismantled more methodically, done with a knife, each slice with the skill of a surgeon. The fresher kills were done with much more haste. Their limbs were torn in thick chunks, which dotted the room, thick gouges that seemed, almost, to have been done by powerful swipes of large claws. Many of the men became sick upon seeing the menagerie before them, letting loose the contents of their stomachs, mixing acid with putrid flesh. Those with stronger constitutions located the servant boy, hiding in a kitchen cupboard, and dragged him out into the square, beating the boy until he found himself able to provide the village with a suitable answer. It wasn't long until the child began to fear for his life, and, through swollen eyes and lips, he lied to the villagers. The boy could see the vehement anger on the faces of the men above him, as they spat and kicked him, and he feared that, if they blamed Dittany for the murders, he may be killed simply by association, if only to sate the town's anger. For this reason, the boy told them that the old chieftain had put a curse on the town and had used his daughter to carry it through the woods with her, and into the White Village, setting up the house to make it look as if Dittany had done the crimes, murdering the grieving husband in the darkness of the night. Appalled by this new revelation and the savagery of the natives' ways, the villagers quickly assembled, leading an attack on the Indians. They raided the tribe and captured the chieftain. The old man tried to explain that the beast that was hunting them was not under his control, nor that of the tribes, but the townspeople would not listen, and a battle began, raging throughout the night. The white men emerged victorious, and what was left of the tribe fled through the village. congregating in these very woods for safety. The first night the Indians set foot on this ground, that tree," Kyle indicated his left, turning on his heel and stalking over to the tree, running a hand along its bark for effect, "was struck by lightning. The very moment a small boy, stabbed by one of the white men, died in his crying mother's arms. The natives, who had taken to cremating the bodies of the dead to avoid their taking by the Wendigo, took this as a sign that this was a tree of death, and that the dead should be turned to ashes in its base. As they burned both bodies of the fallen warriors and the little boy, the crying mother, stricken with grief and covered in blood, walked to the outskirts of the woods, bringing with her an offering, and called out to the Wendigo. Never before had any of the tribe reached out to the creature, but the mother was determined to seek the revenge that she alone could not attain. After several hours, the Wendigo appeared before her, its large figure casting her in what seemed to be an eternal shadow. In the darkness, the mother fell to her knees, offering it a single wild rose, taken from a few that she had laid in her dead son's arms. The minuscule amount of humanity that was left in the beast was moved by the mother's grief, accepting the rose and allowing her to speak. The woman pleaded for the beast to avenge her son by killing all the white men that attacked the village and to protect this land from the white men, so that he could live on for centuries, immortalized in the tree that became his final resting place. After the mother was sure that the Wendigo would keep its word, she bowed her head, knowing that no one who could ask such a creature a favor would live to speak of it. She waited in silence for a few moments before the Wendigo raised its mighty arm above her head, severing it from her shoulders with a single swipe. Randy jumped into me, and Kyle looked back at us, smiling. At that moment, the ultimate payment had been made, and they say that to this day, the beast still wanders these woods, protecting the little boy's legacy, waiting for someone to desecrate the ground so that it can strike again. A rustling sounded from the bushes, and Kyle spun around, his face going white. What is it?" Randy asked, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Knock it off, Kyle," I yelled, rubbing Randy's back soothingly. "You're scaring him." Before Kyle could respond, a black figure jumped from the bushes, tackling Kyle to the ground. He shrieked, "Randy! Randy, run!" Without question, Randy took off, sprinting into the woods and vanishing between the trees. "Randy! Randy, come back!" I called, turning when I heard the sound of raucous laughter from the two boys rolling on the ground. Jack pulled a black hood from his sweatshirt down, slapping a breathless Kyle on the back. "Did you see him run?" "Shut up, that was terrible!" I clenched my fist before bending down, throwing leaves and sticks at the pair. Whoa, Charles, calm down. It was just a joke. We're less than a mile from my house. You'll be fine." Kyle stood, pinning my arms to my side as he spoke, trying to avoid assailing foliage. He let me go as I covered my face, shaking my head. "He's just a kid, Kyle. You shouldn't scare him like that." I felt exhausted. Dealing with the two of them and their insensitive jokes was beyond tiring. All right. I'll make it up to him. Tomorrow. Then I'll call Mom to make sure he made it home safe, okay?" Kyle gave me a lopsided smile, and I slowly acquiesced. Jack stood, stumbling slightly before regaining his balance. I couldn't help but chuckle. "You finished the rest of the beer?" Jack simply glared in response before the corners of his mouth turned up into a self-satisfied smirk. "Not all. But that does remind me." Jack walked over to the tree before unzipping his fly. I made a noise of disgust before covering my eyes, burying my face in the chest of a chuckling Kyle. "Let's see how Mr. Beastie likes that. Jack slurred slightly, walking over to his pack and picking it up with much more grace than I believed him capable of in his current state. Kyle gently lifted up my chin with his index finger, looking into my eyes. "Hey, there's an abandoned house up the way. Why don't we sleep there tonight, huh? A little more privacy." Kyle rubbed his nose against mine, and I raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I've forgiven you quite yet." Kyle flipped his hair to the side, eyeing me closely with a grin. "Well, we've got all night, don't we?" The walk to the abandoned house was relatively peaceful. The wind rustled the trees, and though the discomfort I felt had failed to settle, Kyle's warm hand in mine grounded me, his thumb gently rubbing against my knuckles every so often. Kyle finally called home when we'd arrived at the dilapidated house and, after a good berating by his mother, confirmed that Randy had in fact made it home relatively safe, although rather out of breath. Kyle began to put down sleeping bags as Jack wandered around the house, picking at the peeling wallpaper, another beer in hand. When Kyle was finished setting up for the night, Jack coincidentally excused himself, disappearing out of the hall that had once supported a front door. Well, that was convenient timing. Kyle looked up at me innocently, returning to his bag, searching for something in its depths. "It really was, wasn't it?" "Almost." He paused, pulling a single red rose from his pack, eyeing me from over the red petals. "Like we planned it." I smiled as he leaned in, pressing my lips against his as he slid the stem of the flower between my fingers. We talked for nearly an hour as I fingered the soft petals of the rose, careful to avoid its thorns. At first we spoke of nothing, just little things about our time spent away at college, new friends we had made. It wasn't until I had finished my story about a particularly nasty professor that Kyle attempted to shift the conversation. "Listen, I know that we haven't been seeing eye to eye lately, but I wanted you to know that I really do care about you, and—" A scream tore through the woods, echoing off the empty graffiti-covered walls. Kyle and I froze, looking toward the entrance of the house. "Jack!" Kyle called, his voice filled with trepidation as he reached for the flashlight next to us, turning the beam on with a click, and angled it out into the lawn. We both waited for a moment, straining to hear Jack yell back a slurred, sarcastic reply, but the only answer we received was the fluttering of an old shutter against the decaying drywall of the house. Jack, this isn't funny, man!" Kyle's voice wavered slightly as he stood, making his way to the front steps. I kept my eyes trained on Kyle until he disappeared from sight. A sickening feeling had spread deep into the pit of my stomach, and the intense unease I had felt earlier began to return with renewed vigor. I stood quietly, moving to a broken window, peering out to try and see Kyle. He was sweeping the flashlight back and forth, muttering nervously under his breath. After a few moments, I made my way out into the overgrown lawn, stopping next to Kyle. "Kyle?" "Come on. He's probably just messing with us. That or the drunken idiot's fallen down somewhere." I nervously played with the thorn on the stem of a rose as we descended into the shrubbery, calling Jack's name out into the darkness. Eventually we broke away from the brush, entering into a clearing, a road visible on the other side. There was a steep hill to our right, and I turned to scan its surface, assuming that Jack had attempted to drunkenly climb it. The lights from a passing car flashed across the field, and from the corner of my eyes, I caught the glimpse of something reflective. Kyle was still calling Jack's name and had retreated back to the tree line to continue the search. I stood still, surveying the hill as another set of headlights drew near, shining onto something scuttling up the hill. I narrowed my eyes, focusing on the creature whilst I moved closer. I made it to the base of the hill before I stopped, my heart dropping into my stomach as I attempted to swallow the thick lump that had formed in my throat. The thing was easily 6 feet tall, hunkering close to the ground as it moved on all fours in a sweeping gait. I could make out the contour of its spine poking through its reflective skin, its ribs jutting out with extreme emaciation. As it slinked forward, its wrists twisted unnaturally, and its thin legs strained as it pulled itself forward. I felt every hair raise on my skin, goosebumps spreading across my arms as I took an uneasy step backwards. My ankle twisted and I fell with a yelp, the thorns of the rose sinking into the firm flesh of my palm. Suddenly the creature's head turned. Empty sockets with an eerie yellow glow stared vacantly at me as its mouth dropped open in what appeared to be a silent scream, taut cheeks pulling inwards. I nearly shrieked, covering my mouth with my hands as the thorns of the rose pierced my face. The thing let loose a sickening howl, its body contorting as it launched itself down the hill, barreling towards me. "Kyle! Kyle!" I turned on the spot, blood dripping down my hands as I clenched the rose in my fist, sprinting through the woods, the beam of Kyle's flashlight blinding me as I approached. What is it? I found Jack! The drunk idiot fell—" I felt something grab my jacket, slicing my back as it pulled me from my feet. I slammed into the ground, a sickening crunch echoing somewhere behind my eyes. My vision swam and small grey dots burst in intricate patterns as I attempted to steady my gaze. It took me a moment to regain my sight, and when I did, I vomited onto my hands, the world spinning as tears began to leak from my eyes. I could see Kyle. But Jack. The creature had sunken its claws into Jack's chest, hooking them between his ribs and violently pulling up. I saw the flesh of Jack's chest burst as the ribs were pulled through the ashen skin. The ringing in my ears masked his scream as the creature plowed him into the ground. Its other clawed appendage slid downwards, easily slipping into the soft flesh of Jack's stomach. His intestines falling from the gashes as he grabbed at them, attempting to pick them up and place them back inside the torn flesh. The ringing in my ears finally dulled as I tried to stand, but the world spun violently, and I fell back to my knees. Something warm was rolling down my face and into my eyes. I tried to wipe it away, but the harder I tried, the more there seemed to be. I watched, horrified as a long forked tongue emerged from the creature's mouth, stabbing into Jack's jugular, gurgling noises emanating from the creature's bobbing throat. I pushed myself to my feet and walked away from the creature before falling into a ditch beside the dirt road. I landed on something soft and warm. I craned my neck to see the unconscious form of Kyle laying beneath me, his leg twisting at an odd angle. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, the screen flashing as I unlocked it. Again, I heard a horrible howl as the creature swiped my phone from my hand, repeatedly slicing at it with its claws until the device turned black. I could hear its wheezing breath, and from where I was lying, I could see it clearly. Its skin was like a metallic, magnetic fluid, reflecting with little spikes rising here and there as it moved, flattening into a glass when it stilled. It had no nose, and its mouth an empty hole that seemed to have no end. I sobbed in abject fear as the creature turned to face me, its eyes swirling pools of electric yellow. Slowly, it turned its head to the side, a single, bloody clawed appendage reaching toward me. I screamed and it recoiled slightly before reaching out again, poking something in my hands. The rose. Its claws lightly traced the flower before it leaned in, its shuddering breath lightly teasing my face. Quickly I was thrown aside. I landed on my back against a tree a few feet away. I screamed as I watched the creature slice across Kyle's chest. "Please!" My voice was hoarse and my body shook with sobs. "Please, don't Don't kill him, please. It turned its head to the side, much like a confused dog before abandoning Kyle and approaching me again. Its face neared mine, and I couldn't help but look away, shaking with fear. I felt the tongue of the creature trace my cheek, sliding along my neck and down my arm. I whimpered, expecting it to deliver a final blow, as I held my breath, clenching my eyes shut. Instead, I felt the creature wrench open my fist and pull the rose, its thorns still lodged in my palm, from my hand. My eyes opened instinctually, and our gazes met for a brief moment. Then, without a sound, the creature turned, darting into the oppressing darkness and disappearing beneath the shadowy veil. The police say that a ranger found Kyle and I in the afternoon, 2 days later, unconscious and bleeding from several impressive wounds. They found the body of Jack nearly 3 weeks later, in nearly 30 miles away from the attack site. The rangers decided that he must have been dragged by the animal that had attacked us, although the report was scarcely detailed and no particular animal had been identified. Kyle, unfortunately, never fully recovered. The doctors said it was the trauma that made him lose his mind, ranting about a black creature that runs around the woods at night. Of course, I believed him, but the medication and therapy made me rethink the entire experience, eventually coming to the conclusion that it had, in fact, been a bear that mauled us and not something from an Indian folktale. I returned to college in a year, and my parents decided that we should move, to help me put the past behind me. I agreed and suggested somewhere in the city, far, far away from the woods. It wasn't until I moved into my new apartment, now many years later, that I realized I would never forget. As, even now, when I look out my apartment window and to the small patch of woods behind my complex, I can see it there, staring back at me, patiently waiting. Because no matter how many variations of stories I read, or how many folklore specialists I consult, they can all say one thing for certain about the creature lurking among the trees. One never makes a bargain with the Wendigo, and lives to tell the tale.
Camp by Mac Ralston. Camp is a style that prefers outrageous and exaggerated substance, a palate for bad taste. A camp is a temporary lodge typically dwelled in by travelers or adventurers. And camp is, well, the story you're about to read, both campy in the style and substance, and named ever so fittingly after the nickname given to Camp Neil Harsey, the Camp. Camp Neil Harsey got its unfortunately fortunate nickname from the nearby silver waters of Lake Neil Harsey, and the legend harbored beneath. See, at Lake Neil Harsey, there's something of an urban myth that served as the lake's and surrounding campgrounds' claim to fame. The Neil Harsey River Monkey. Now, if you've never heard of the river monkey, you'd be forgiven, because essentially it doesn't exist. At least to some. To others, the river monkey is a deeply endearing icon of the lakeside forests of North America, a less respected Bigfoot or Nessie in virtually every way. Yet it, too, has its share of disciples, and most of them, rather conveniently, live within 50 miles of the Neil Harsey, which, mind you, is not a river but a lake. So the whole river monkey name, in and of itself, doesn't make a lick of sense, and neither does the legend at large. Now, you'd think that an oversized river-dwelling primate would be the last thing on people's minds, but you'd also be wrong. See, people eat this kind of thing up, especially in the middle of nowhere, where the only thing to do is to hunt down a fictionalized monkey man. "Of course he's real," the hick spat, depositing the rest of his loogie aside his boot and grinding it into the dirt. "No one ain't seen him 'cause he's hiding." "Why is he hiding?" Ella asked cynically, jotting an X adjacent to the two others, winning her 7th game of tic-tac-toe against herself, her only worthy opponent. She did have some notes on the page, but her mind had clocked out hours ago. Was this really worth it? Driving all the way out to Tumfuck 2, wasting who knows how much precious petroleum, just to interview some backwoods, probably inbred, tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy nut, all in the name of a cheap buck. She didn't have an answer. She never did. But she was there, wasn't she? Smack dab in the middle of nowhere. And this wasn't the first time. What was it last month again? Bat Boy? That was a good one. How about the woman that was having sex with her husband's ghost? Or the guy who claimed he was molested by a yeti? There were some weird folks that lived in the middle of nowhere. And, of course, by the middle of nowhere, she meant the podunks. Pocketed little cesspools squirming with the kookiest weirdos on God's green earth. And, if you could believe it, some of those weirdos made the other weirdos look like beacons of normalcy by sheer comparison, which only proved just how wacky some people could get when cut off from the outside world. Thankfully, most of the fringe types were harmless folks, but every now and again, there'd be one that'd stir the pot, tip the scale from conspiracy to collusion, like those crackpots that cut crop circles, the ones that gave them all a bad rap. And if they didn't, she most certainly could. "Well, think about it," the man said, interrupting her inner monologue abruptly. Dribble still dribbled on his scruffy chin. "If he's caught, the government will probably cut him up and experiment and shit on him." "Mm-hmm," Ella nodded, biting her tongue. "Anything else?" The man stood, obtusely quiet, until he sprang alert. "Oh yeah," he said, rushing back into his house. Not 5 seconds later did he emerge with a folded-up piece of paper, handing it over to Ella. "I drew this as soon as I saw him. The police told me it wasn't evidence, but I swear he looked exactly like that." It was the most crudely drawn picture of a monkey she'd ever seen. So much so that it looked like a 4th grader would have laughed at it. She couldn't help but crack a grin, one that only widened when she noticed the same faded print on the man's wife-beater. He must have noticed her eyesight as he, too, looked down at the scribbling on his shirt, and smiled a toothy grin. "You like it?" he asked, eyes wide. "Old Neil Hassey liked it so much that they started selling it on t-shirts. I make royalties now." "Where do they sell it?" "The gift shop. I got some extras if you want one." "What size is you?" the man asked, looking down at the woman's blouse and embarrassedly twitching back to eye contact with a nervous smile. "I'm good, thanks. That'll be all." Ella nodded with a click of her tongue and pen. Of all the podunks she had traversed in her travels, this one was the podunkiest. Ella and her brand new Lincoln Continental, now in need of a fresh wash, stuck out like a sore thumb amidst the vast array of dilapidated houses and shacks that aligned the dirt road leading to her undesirable destination, Camp Neil Hassey, which was a place that should have only been visited by middle schoolers with an undeveloped brain. Yet, the good old downtown tattletale insisted that Ella Lancaster drive her sweet ass 1,000 miles into the boonies to milk yet another tragedy, all in the name of exploitation. It was a young boy this time, 13-year-old Cody Hodgson, and unlike the guy that got fondled by the abominable snowman, this kid wasn't able to book an interview, because he went missing. She could see the cover now. Young camper snatched by river monkey. Not the kind of thing the parents probably wanted to read, but according to the charts, 20 or so odd million subscribers did. The approaching fork in the road picked at the question feasting on her mind. Continue on or go home? The fast lane back the way she came was right there, after all. But if she chose it, she could kiss that overdue promotion goodbye. But maybe she didn't want it. It was the sleaziest tabloid in town, after all. Not exactly a career she saw herself in. But it paid the bills. So, with an internal release, she let her foot off the brake and travelled onward. It was the dog days of summer for sure, but not even the dog dared to stick its snout out into the sun. Instead, it merely licked itself under the shade of an overgrown oak, wrapped in the same metal chain that drooped from its neck. Not far away, beside an old school bus, whose yellow had faded a sickly white, was a mailbox, perhaps fashioned in the same shade of the oak, which looked as if it had been hit by a dozen or so times by a stray pickup. And though it couldn't sing like a dog, the worn and rusted hinges on that box attested to the history and reputation of Camp Nilhasi, which had seen its fair share of eviction slips over the years. Yet here it stood anyway. The only thing not standing, in fact, was the operator of the fine establishment, a gentleman by the name of Stanley Reese, who at one time was something of a lively, happy-go-lucky son of a gun, now diminished to something of a neurotic, rocking back and forth on the porch swing that hung against the camp office window and murmuring nonsensicals to himself. Then, in an instant, a brand spanking new Lincoln Continental pulled through the brush and broke to a stop atop the dusty gravel. A sight for sore eyes for Stanley, considering all the cops in and out of the place over the last 4 days. But when he noticed a fancy pants blouse and smug, chiseled woman step from the elegant upholstery, something told him his worry wasn't for nothing. He descended the porch and skipped across the hot dirt on the balls of his bare feet. And when he reached Ella, he smiled. Not genuinely, of course, but wide enough to pass off his falsetto tone as genuine. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What brings you around these parts?" He smelled like smoke, somewhere in between a cigarette and a campfire. He probably hadn't showered in days, made apparent by the caked-on layers of sweat that clung to his face, and the unkempt ball of hair on his head that looked like a sleeping cat. A dead sleeping cat. "I take it you're Stanley Reese?" The man nodded, clumsily. "I'm Ella. I'm with the Downtown Tattletale. I have some questions about Cody Hodgson." The man ran his fingers through the dead cat on his head, sighing heavily. "Let me level with you, ma'am," the man pleaded, that falsetto tone dropping like a bead of sweat, which, rest assured, were dropping too. "I can tell you all about the difference between a clove hitch and a half hitch. Hell, I can show you how to kayak, shoot an arrow, and start a bonfire before time to eat lunch. But listen, I don't know how to answer all these legal questions. Hell, I didn't even finish high school." Ella didn't bother with her notebook this time. She nodded out of what little, genuine pity she had for the well-meaning man and rephrased her prompt. "All I want to know is what happened, from your point of view." "Well, I mean, I didn't see much of anything. I was getting supper ready and some of the campers swarmed me, told me about Cody. Immediately I thought the worst. Hell, I didn't know the kid could swim. But the cops never found any body in the lake. He's just gone." Ella nodded, biting her lip before asking, "What campers?" "Oh, friends of his, I take it. Dozen or so boys. They all felt terrible. See, they told me that they told Cody that if he went into the outhouse, a spider would crawl up his butthole and lay eggs in his stomach. Kids, right? Anyways, the kid refused to even look at the damn latrine. So he decided to go pop a squat out in the woods. After about 45 minutes or so, when supper was almost ready, one of our counselors asked his cabin mates where Cody was, and they didn't know. Then they all came to me." Ella logged the story in the back of her mind, like chicken scratch on her soggy brain. She could tell that Stanley couldn't stand another question about the boy, so she opted to ask what was, in her eyes, a seemingly harmless one. "So, do you think it was the monkey?" Stanley swallowed back any words he might have been rash to say. Clearly he had something on his mind, but his shifty eyes suggested that he might not have been at liberty to say it. After 2 more glances, east and westward, confirming that no one else was around, he moved in closer on Ella, who could smell the sweat under his pants. That monkey is the reason the camp's still standing. People love that shit, pardon my French, so much so that we got a damn gift shop about him. So, real, not real, doesn't matter to me. Myself. And I didn't even go to business school, ma'am. So you're saying it's a hoax? All I'm saying is that we're about to get a lot more business. River Monkey for president and I survived the River Monkey and all I got was this lousy t-shirt were just some of the designs in the gift shop. Not to mention the Hicks eyewitness drawing, available in 6 different colors. There were plushies, coffee mugs, and even a bobblehead pen of the thing. But what struck her as the most intriguing was a wall of masks. Plastic pieces of garbage covered in faux hair that felt like peach fuzz glued to a to-go box. And aside from the fact that they were almost out of stock and selling for $25, she couldn't get over the fact that they might have been a clue in this whole thing. With her disposable, she snapped a shot. I take it you won't be buying nothing? A moist voice said. Ella turned sharply around with a gasp and noticed a young woman, no older than 23, standing behind the counter and chewing a wad of gum. The pigtails from her hair bounced with every smack of her lips, and Ella wondered why she hadn't noticed her before. But the real question was why she was there at all. Sorry, Ella said with a relieving breath. I didn't see you there. I thought you were the River Monkey? Yeah, I get that a lot. The girl reached into a drawer and removed the wad, sticking it beneath the countertop, alongside a dozen or so other flavors. You believe in that thing? Ella asked. The girl shrugged. I was going to say Stanley, but that too. Ella nodded with a half smile. Who are... I'm Stanley's girlfriend, the girl said before Ella had time to finish. I keep watch over their shop and bookkeeping. You're the lady from the papers, huh? She asked. She was far too young to be Stanley's girlfriend, but it seemed like that wasn't going to stop them. Not down here. The downtown tattletale, yeah, she said, stepping closer to the register counter. Yeah, I've read that before. You make us country folk look like hillbillies, she said, a sour look on her face. We're not all crazy, you know. Ella nodded softly. I know, sorry. It was a relief saying that word, for what might have been the first time. Oh, that's right, the girl said, noticing the embarrassment on Ella's face. The name's Angie, she said as she extended her hand. Ella. The girl's hand was softer than she expected, and yet her grip was firmer. Those masks sell well? Ella asked. Angie looked over her shoulder and nodded. Oh yeah, most popular thing we sell. The campers like to scare each other, especially around the fire, telling ghost stories and whatnot, and then popping out in them masks. It's pretty funny. Not bad, Ella said with a smile. You ever think their pranks go too far? Angie shrugged. I don't know. One time we had a kid fall in a river with his pants down. I guess his friends might have taken that a little too far. Ella nodded in understanding, stepping even closer to the countertop. Another step and she would have been touching it. Reason I ask is because Stanley said this kid had bullies. You think they'd ever do anything to hurt him? Angie chewed on the question for a second, popping a quarter into the gumball machine on the counter and twisting, a bright red sphere barely dropping into her hand before she jammed it into her mouth and crunched. The rack of masks stared back at her from across the wooden shack, and she put 2 and 2 together. Are you saying they framed the River Monkey? Ella shrugged. Are you? Angie couldn't answer that one. I think it'd be hard to mistake a giant monkey for a 12-year-old kid in a Halloween mask, Angie said, duly noting the rack of masks. It was clear that the implication was a bit steep, even for Ella. How about the employees? Could any of them have done it? The counselors? Angie asked. Her voice was raised. Surely any finger pointed at one of them was 4 pointed back at herself. Or was it 3? If you're asking if they kidnapped the kid, you'd best talk to Stan. And not even he'd know. she said, a shot of hot air escaping her nostrils as she chortled. "What, you think we run background checks out here?" Ella knew they didn't. Could have been anyone. And anyone came in the form of a crudely torn piece of paper wedged ever so conveniently beneath the driver's side windshield wiper of her Lincoln. She had just finished photographing the place as the sun began setting, and if she was going to reach the hotel before midnight, she needed to get going. The one-landed country road stretched on for miles, and it wasn't like she could take the freeway. Angie and Stanley bid her farewell with a parting gift, or perhaps just a bribe to keep her article positive, a t-shirt with a doodle that was all too familiar to her by this point. She smiled and thanked them and returned to the car, and that's when she saw it. The paper. It looked as if it had been ripped from a spiral notebook, the paper moist and grungy and smeared with a nearly illegible semblance of letters. Yet somehow, she could faintly read the words, "I know," followed by an address, a tip. It would have been foolish for any woman, especially one as young and as ambitious as Ella, to drive out to some lonesome house in the middle of nowhere, and in the middle of the night, and waltz right through the front door. God knows what might have been waiting for her. But then again, Ella was young, and she was ambitious. The drive was only about 5 miles or so, yet the curved and treacherous terrain made the spiraling journey at least about an hour. All the while, the moon's reflection off the Nilhasi acted as a sort of guide, the only beacon of light aside from her zigzagging high beams, which weren't doing her much of any good. She had almost struck 2 trees and killed a deer, so it was a relief when she first caught glimpse of the house. The first one she had seen in what felt like miles. It was a solitary, beat-up-looking place, engulfed in a nearly endless darkness, if not for the single bulb that illuminated the front porch. What the light revealed was about as tired-looking as she must have been, and for a moment, in her state of numbed weirdness, it dawned on her that this whole thing might have been one big practical joke, a wild goose chase orchestrated by some dumb kids or a pissed-off camp operator and his girlfriend. She was a fool, and though she should have turned back, something in her, call it her drive or that sheer ambition, she forced herself from that Lincoln, up the front steps, and onto the welcome mat, which, if it were trying to welcome her, definitely missed its hospitable mark, being about as tattered and worn as the note from her windshield. "Hello?" The voice was about as abrupt as the entire situation was, and yet, she still wasn't expecting it. She was spooked. Through a crack in the door, she could make out a dimly lit face. A man, his skin lumpy and stretched, with jet-black hair jutting out of his ears and nose. "Sorry," she said, composing herself. "Are you the one that left that note on my car?" The man nodded. "Yes." He tried to pull open the door when it snagged on the metal chain. He tried again, harder this time. "You've got to unlatch the..." Ella started, but before she could finish, the man ripped the chain from the dry, rotted wood, its hinges squeaking as it opened wide, filling the dark house with the same dull glow of the porch light. "Thanks," she murmured and stepped inside. The first step she took forced her to dip down about 1/2 inch or so to the floor, her weight forcing the wood to creak. She caught her bearings and surveyed the house as she approached a dining room table amidst what was, largely, an empty room cast in blackness of night. And rolling in from that darkness became a pungent, rancid smell, perhaps a whiff of mucky lake water through an opened window, or a dead critter beneath the elevated flooring. Either way, it stunk like a skunk, and the man seemed not to notice or not to care. "I don't know what happened," he said, bending down to sit across from her at the table, interrupting her self-talk. The chair bowed at his sitting. He was so large a man, and it creaked similarly to the floor. "And who are you exactly?" She smiled despite her facial muscles stiffening. The man took in a long, deep breath. "I'm a bus driver," he said, his voice low and drawled, as if he was drugged or on drugs. "I drive the bus for the camp. Ella nodded excitedly. Surely an employee, especially one with knowledge of the campgrounds, such as a bus driver, would have known something of note. She took out her pad and pen.
What did you see, sir?
The man breathed in.
I'm a river monkey,
he said. Ella laughed, but the man remained firm in his expression.
Mainly, it makes me dress up like a monkey.
The man stood and stomped over to the closet, pulling it open and retrieving from its depths a large fur suit, brown and matted like any run-of-the-mill gorilla suit from a 5-and-dime Halloween store. The man dragged the suit over the table and laid it across the tempered wood. Ella ran her fingers through the fur and stared up at the man, whose demeanor was still unchanged. "Why does he make you dress up?" she said, a smile cracking her lips open.
I said it's good for the camp. Legend of River Monkey bring tourists and dollars.
And the kid?
He's okay.
The man smiled elastically.
He's in on the joke.
Ella blew out a confused sigh, rummaging her fingers through her long silky hair as what was a build-up of somewhat nervous laughter belched out from within her. "So it was a publicity stunt," she laughed, shaking her head. "I knew it. I damn well knew it. What about the papers? The news?"
All in on the joke. Brings the tourists and the dollars.
Ella slapped the table. A smile wider than her cheeks spread across her face. Of all the kooky stories she had heard over the years, over her many travels nationwide, this one was the kookiest. She pulled out her disposable camera and aimed it readily at the suit draped over the table's ledge. Before she pushed the little black button, she stopped herself and glanced up at the towering man. "You don't mind, do you?" "No," the man said, lifting a large hand. She snapped away. After she was finished snapping, she politely thanked the man and stood from her seat. This was going to make one hell of a story, and if she could manage an interview with Cody Hodgson, it might even make the front page of the next issue, she thought. "Thank you, Mr.
Bob,"
the man said. "Bob, thank you." Ella turned to face the door when the long road ahead dawned on her. It'd be hours before she reached the hotel. "Might I use your bathroom?" she asked, turning back around to face him. Bob looked off into the shadowy darkness, assumingly towards the bathroom in question, and nodded his head slowly. "I'll only take a moment," she said before entering the darkness and finding her place. It was cold in this part of the house, and after her eyes adjusted, she could make out the frame of a door filled with the hue from a nearby window, overlooking Lake Nilhasi. It really was a beautiful sight. But her enjoyment was cut short by the returning stench that quickly filled the room, even stronger than it was before. She locked the bathroom door and, not unlike her, began to snoop diligently. And when she stuck her nose too close to the shower curtain, she backed away, knowing all too well that she had found the source of the smell. With one tug, she pulled back the curtain and a wall of that same stench hit her face. She teared up with one breath, stepped back, and had to force her eyes open to see what it was. A black mass lying in the tub. It was a body. That of a shriveled, eaten-away young boy. Cody Hodgson, no doubt. Before a moment to process, there was a thud at the door, a jingling of the handle, before Bob's voice, muted and monotone, pushed through from the other side.
"Open the door,"
he said. The handle jingled again.
"What the hell is this?"
Ella screamed. Bob didn't answer, and after a deafening silent moment, there was another loud thud from the other side of the door.
"Open the door,"
the voice said. It was Bob's voice, but it was far deeper than even a moment before. Ella didn't respond. She had already shuffled along the bathroom wall to the window, trying to pry the rusted metal open, and wouldn't budge. The handle began jiggling faster, the thuds ramping into a succession of loud, heavy bangs.
"Open! Open! Open!"
The voice screeched. It was deep and booming. It no longer sounded human. as if Bob was completely replaced by something awful, an animal. The repeated lone word from the voice began to lose all semblance of meaning, as though the voice itself didn't even know what it was trying to say. The handle kept spastically shaking until it flew off the hinges, falling to the floor and rattling. Then suddenly, 2 long, hairy fingers poked through the hole where the handle once sat and scraped at the wood violently. When they made little progress, they retreated, and the hole was instead filled with the nostrils of something, huffing deeply through the small opening. The noises it made were panicked and shrill, like that of a tortured chimpanzee. Ella screamed, thrusting her pen into the brittle glass window with all of her might. 2 jabs and it cracked, 3 and it shattered, and 1 leap off the toilet, and she fell a story down and into the muddy grass below. She would have never loved the feel of mud and grass against her skin, but now it was the only thing she wanted to feel. Relief. She jumped to her feet and dashed for the car, not turning back. She could hear rummaging from within the house as she fled. A boost of adrenaline filled her as she turned the corner of the house and saw the Lincoln Continental, and with a final gust, she reached the car, flung the door open and jumped inside, locking it immediately. She caught her breath, but only for a moment. As she shoved the key into the ignition and turned it, the high beams flashed on, and that's when she, finally, saw it. The Nilhasi River Monkey. It was halfway from the house to the lake, sprinting with all its might with its jagged stagger. It must have been 7 feet tall and covered in a mangy coat of jet black hair, and unlike the image in her head, it was lanky, not bulky like the traditional ape she'd seen at the zoo, and at the same time, it was like the image she had seen, the ugly one the Hick had drawn. It really was that ugly. In its arm it held Cody Hodgson, what was left of the boy anyway. He was hanging from its gangly hand, which nearly touched the ground, and from what she could tell, there was something else hanging off its wet fur. Skin. A type of rubbery suit fashioned from human skin, which at one point she might have called Bob. It took a final glance over to the headlights, its beady eyes glowing with the reflection of the high beams, and jumped into the gloomy water without another beat. Ella, without waiting around herself, put the car in reverse and hightailed it out of there. All she had after that were a panic attack and a couple of pictures, mostly of a run-down summer camp and a dirty old monkey suit, which wasn't exactly going to make her story any easier. The house, she'd come to find out, was abandoned, and the body of little Cody Hodgson was, as she knew it, vacated from the premises. Either in the stomach of that thing, or somewhere along the bottom of the Nilhasi. The only thing left she had to go off of was her own testimony, which, given her track record of falsified tales, wouldn't have held up all too well either. No one would ever believe her. Not even the folks back at the downtown Tattletale, who never took any of this shit seriously anyway. And who could blame them? Who could blame her? That's at least the story they're going with at Old Camp, with variations here and there, of course. Some of the times the yarn is spun around the fire. The campers go into the gory details of how the river monkey ate her guts out. That one usually ruins most of the group's appetites for s'mores. Or some of the times, fueled by her lust for that promotion of hers, Ella becomes the river monkey herself. A clever little plot twist for a bunch of middle schoolers, don't you think? The truth of the matter, if such a thing even exists for such a ridiculous, campy story, is that we'll never truly know. We either listen to the witness of a pathological liar, a greedy summer camp, a handful of conspiracy theorists, or a bunch of middle schoolers. Funny. That's exactly how the river monkey would have liked it. The Spindler by Ryan Brenneman.
I want to hear about the Spindler.
Logan listened as the 3 voices of his friends talked. He watched as the fire before him dwindled. Sure you want to do that, Lexi? In these woods? Logan's back was firmly set against the back of a broad old oak. He sat on the ground between its roots. His fingers dug unconsciously into the dirt as the flames flickered.
Yes, Adam, I do. That's why we came here.
Night was upon them now. In the forest, it caught between the branches like silk, threatening to fall in around Logan the moment the dim light faded. The fire wouldn't hold it back for long. Okay. Guess you're right about that. Somewhere above the treetops surely sat stars, shining bright as ever, but not through the canopy, not through that physical night. Logan could feel it pressing down on him like the weight of the ocean.
Then let's do it. Would you start us off, Adam?
She stood on the other side of the fire, pacing back and forth, looking at Logan's right. No, Lexi. No, that's a Dom thing, man. Ask Dom. Adam sat there, lazily sprawled sideways across the arms of an old lawn chair. He pointed a beer bottle across the flames to Logan's left. A voice there responded.
I'm not feeling it tonight. Sorry, guys.
Logan flinched as the fire reared unexpectedly. A long stick held by Dom prodded the fire's heart. The flames hissed and flashed against it like angry vipers. Dom's voice came again. Fire's not long for this world anyways. So, no, Adam. Sorry, Lexi. The stick retracted from the fire, having failed to bring it any new life. Logan glanced towards where Dom sat, rested on an old stump, stick in hand, fire reflecting off of his glasses. He just shook his head.
Come on, Dom. Please. Do it for me.
Logan felt nauseous as Lexi's voice pleaded. Adams followed. Yeah, man, do it. Might as well, right? And who cares about fire anyways? Makes it better without it. Darker. Scarier. Logan felt Lexi's eyes on him from across the fire. He turned his gaze down, away from the fire and into his lap. He shuddered when he heard her voice ask.
You okay, baby?
He closed his eyes. There was laughter to his right. Is he okay? I think it's pretty obvious he's not. Look at him. Logan wrapped his arms around his chest as the weight of the night became a cold sting on his skin. The hair on his arms stood erect, and his chest shuddered as Lexi's voice yelled.
Adam, stop it.
She was moving to his left, around the fire, towards him.
Adam is your point, Lexi. This might not be the best foot.
She sat down right next to Logan. He gasped. Her hand was on his shoulder, massaging him. The other one slipped through his matted hair.
This is exactly what he needs. He was the one who wanted to come up here in the first place, to face his fears. Right, baby?
Logan didn't move. Yeah, but what's the point if he don't play along? Look at him, Lexi. He won't even listen to the story. He's just gonna play along, that's that. Sorry, Dom. Logan won't play. The hands crept down his body, one down his neck, and one down his arm. The one arm wrapped around his bicep and squeezed, then a whisper.
You'll be fine. Just play along.
The trees rustled, but Logan felt no breeze. He kept his eyes closed tightly. Lexi's voice grew louder. He's gonna be fine, Dom. Please, tell the story. Logan heard the stick enter the fire once more. It brushed against the ashes. Charred logs fell. Embers hissed as they floated away, drowned by the night. Logan, can you look at me? They waited, but Logan knew they wouldn't wait long. The hand gripped around his arm gave a tender but meaningful squeeze. The kind that meant, without saying a word, please. A familiar kind of squeeze, one that had lost all of its magic.
Baby, look at Dom, please.
Her words were a special kind, light to hear, but heavy with an implication. The implication that she wouldn't ask again. Logan opened his eyes. What do you know about the Spindler? Logan could see Lexi's hair, the outline of her face that glowed like amber in the dying light of the fire. Her eyes were hidden by shadow. Dom pushed his glasses back up his nose with his free hand, gripping his long fire prod that sat resting on his lap with the other.
He shifted a little around the stump he sat on, waiting for an answer. Well, baby? There was only one answer to give, but Logan didn't want to give it. Don't. Logan shook his head. Please don't. Her hand caressed his hair. Air whistled across the mouth of the beer bottle, laughing again from Logan's right. Told you, didn't I? Told you he wouldn't play. Taunting, abrasive, just like Adam. The hand fell to his neck. Logan felt the nails scratching his skin, gently, very gently. Then, less so. I only know its name, Logan stated quickly. That's it, I swear. I only know its name. He remembered she wouldn't ask again. The nails stopped scratching and hand relaxed. Logan continued. You don't talk about it. You don't. Kids do when they're young. When they're bad. It's like sex. You talk about it when your mom's back is turned. You talk about it when it's dark. You giggle about it with your friends. You lie. I know nothing about the Spindler. I swear. Her arm wrapped around his waist. He shuddered as her head touched his shoulder. Good job, baby. There was a glimmer from the bottle, and a chuckle. Logan couldn't help but look. Adam was hunched over in his seat now, staring down at the ground. Between his legs he toyed with the beer bottle, spinning the base around in circles, and raised it to his lips. It's law, Logan. You know more than that, man. You gots to. No more than a name. Dom knew more than that. Lexi knew more than that. You know it lives here. In these woods. Where Mommy and Daddy tell you not to go. He lifted the bottom of the bottle into the shadows above. He sighed in refreshing satisfaction. He's not totally lying, Adam. I don't think anyone knows about the Spindler. Not really. I'd be surprised that either you or Lexi knew anything more than this. No one goes in these woods. Not since long ago. But I guess we're proof that isn't true. Lots of people go in here. Lots of people. And almost never come out. Lexi's head shifted. How long ago? Logan squirmed. Lexi's hand was cold on his back. She held him tight. He had no energy to fight back. In Dom's lenses, the flames were almost mesmerizing, but still fading. Flames barely crackled as the answer was given. Ancient. The Spindler's ancient, and so's this forest. No one can imagine how long. No one would want to. When the natives came, they found it. They let it be. Can you imagine? With how many tales you've heard of skinwalkers, wendigos, and every evil spirit they could have imagined. Would you ever believe there was one so bad that they just pretended it never existed? The question was punctuated by a crack outside the dome of the safe light, somewhere beyond. Nothing followed it. Nothing emerged. Nothing else moved. Not even bugs chirped in the dark. Silence. Logan turned, but only he moved. The only part of Lexi that moved was her mouth. Is that why we avoid it? Because they did? Silence. No, Lexi. I guess it's got something to do with instinct. I mean, I know Logan feels it. The weight of this place. Other forests have a pulse. They're alive, in motion. This one? It's static. It's dead. Like the world doesn't move here. Almost 1,000 acres. And I think it particularly unnerves people when something is dead, yet it still looks back at you. The flames came less and less. A deep orange burned at the heart of the embers, but nothing more. Logan could almost feel the cold night lapping against his back, like cold black waves. Soon not even a tree would make him feel safe. That's nice and flowery and all, Dom. But what is it? The Spindler. What is it, man? Over Adam's voice, he heard something more. Was that another crack? Logan couldn't bring himself to look. It had come from the other side of Lexi, higher than the ground, surely. Her head didn't move. It all depends on what you've been told, I suppose. Some say it's a spirit. Rather mundane explanation if you ask me. Others say it's evil incarnate. But I think that's a bit too presumptuous. A little melodramatic. I think that it just is. Lexi's jaw moved. What do you mean? Dom fixed his glasses one more time with his free hand, his face angled up towards the canopy. Hell if I know. But it's the senseless that makes the whole sense when it comes to the Spindler. You have to think a bit outside the box. His face snapped down towards Logan as the question was asked. What do you think the Spindler looks like, Logan? Logan didn't want to answer. Even though he could, the image in his head lived horribly there. And even worse, it fit just beautifully in the darkness above. He pictured it there, sitting, watching. He pictured and said, a spider. A giant spider. There was a sigh. Logan held his head down, away from the canopy. That's what most people assume. I've heard it many times. A spider with 1,000 eyes, and it's... A spider with 1,000 eyes, and a beaming human smile. One that crawls across the canopy, living between the tops of the trees. Maybe one with legs thick around his tree trunks. But I've also heard that it looks like a man. Monstrous, with fangs and claws for fingers. Then I've heard more. Some more man-like, others more beastly. And yet, some follow none of those. The most intriguing of tales will tell you that the Spindler is an abstraction. There was surely another crack. Maybe two. In the woods beyond the fire, past an impenetrable wall of night, something lurked. Logan was the only one who cared. There was a chuckle from Adam's side of the fire. What the hell is that supposed to mean? You know what he's talking about, Lexi? Logan felt her shoulders rise and shrug. It means, Adam, that the Spindler just is. But it isn't. It has form when it wants, and when it doesn't, then it simply isn't. It doesn't live in the canopy. It is the canopy. The darkness that blocks the sun, the stars, the darkness that follows you and descends upon you with its claws and teeth. Logan's breath came in rasps. Lexi's hand had stopped massaging him. Logan didn't even realize, nor did he notice that only a lone flame still flickered in the fire pit. He didn't even notice the snapping in the distance. The footsteps of someone or something had become regular. He could only focus on the layer of night that loomed above, thick enough to block the heavens. Sound came from there as well. Do you know why some people think it looks like a spider? Lexi's arm raised, ready to answer Dom's question. Oh, I know. It's because of the webs, right? The black webs? Perhaps the sounds were natural, but Logan didn't believe in all that. The sounds surrounded him. Logan's eyes darted around, and they caught something different. Adam was standing, holding the bottle to his lips. Yeah, the black webs. Spider always leaves them about the forest, hanging them in single strands wherever it chooses. Adam didn't say a word. Not anymore. He just lowered his bottle and his face hung towards the fire. Only the voices of Lexi and Dom continued. And you can get stuck in them, right, Dom? People get stuck in them? The sounds were getting closer. Footsteps. They had to be. But in the trees as well? Like helpless flies, Lexi. People go into these woods and the Spindler sees that they never come out. You see, the webs are made out of the same darkness that the Spindler itself is, and they're so thin you can only ever see them if you're looking for them. Yet, once they have you, they won't let go. You can scream. In fact, it lets you scream, the Spindler. It watches it all. Footsteps. Too many to count. Every direction. And then, when it has you, it keeps you. You belong to the Spindler, Lexi. Logan, you belong to the woods. Tears welled in Logan's eyes.
What does it do with those it keeps, Tom? Tell us about them. The scarecrows?
Logan's heart dropped. Too hot to breathe. He gasped. The scarecrows are what the Spindler does for fun. You listen to those the Spindler lets leave the forest because that's the only way you get out. It has to let you. Listen to those lucky few, and they'll tell you about the scarecrows. The scarecrows are the ones it mutilates, twists, and contorts. They're the ones it hangs. Hanged by the same black threads they were ensnared on to make it easy for the Spindler to do whatever it pleases with them. And it can do a whole lot with them. It likes to drop them right in front of people, far away in the distance. Doesn't matter, because it make them move, just a bit, by tugging on their strings. Maybe it'll make them dance, run at you. Some say it copies voices well enough to sound all too human when the corpses scream at you in vain. They shout warnings. It tells you to run right into its traps, using the victim's voices. Logan tried to stand. He tried to run. But Lexi held him down. Her face didn't look away from Dom.
Hold on, baby, we're almost to the end. What else does the Spindler do, Dom? It's not just silly scarecrows, is it?
Logan struggled, but her grasp was firm. Well, like I said, it only makes scarecrows out of the boring ones. Loners. Losers. The rest? Well, it keeps them there for a bit longer. What it does with them in the long run? Who knows? They don't leave here. Their bodies aren't found. Maybe they become part of it. Maybe they're fuel that keeps it going. Until then, it makes use of you. Plays with you. Toys with you. For as long as it can. The advancing footsteps reached a crescendo. Logan knew they were surrounded. No way out. The flame died, and the noises stopped, almost like they were waiting. It makes you a puppet. Dom stoked the flame, and just for a moment, Logan saw them. Surrounding the fire pit on every side, faceless, naked bodies. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only Dom's voice clinging to the chilling air. And he's really good at it. Really good. Good at voices. Adam laughed, bringing the bottle that had been empty for the last hour up to his lips. Good emotions. Dom, his hand wrapped closed irreversibly around the long stick, drew it from the fire and set it on his lap. His voice finished, from somewhere up above. And it's very, very good at making it all seem so real. As the light faded for the last time, Logan felt Lexi's hand on his chin. It made him look. He saw them again, as he had hours before. From Lexi's pale eyes, from the center of her pupils, emerged two thin strands of black webbing. They reached upwards, into the night, to the Spindler. Her mouth moved before the darkness crashed around them, from somewhere up above.
What do you think, Logan?
Do you believe?